Hey everyone, and welcome to yet another weekly wisdom. Today I'm excited to bring to you a conversation or a quick discussion on the stakeholders we should all be engaged with as diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals or as DEI teams. So, in case you're not aware, diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals have to engage with a multitude of stakeholders. And during this 10-minute weekly wisdom, I want to give you a short list of just 5 of the many stakeholders DEI team members and leaders should be engaged with. So that's exactly what we'll be dealing with today and thinking through. I'm loving being back here and talking to you about all of the great things that make diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals work interesting. And this, in my opinion, is one of the most important things we need to be thinking about as diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals, because we inherently work really closely with many different people. And in order to get buy-in across an organization, we need to make sure that we are bringing all of those stakeholders along. So again, here are 5 stakeholders all DEI teams must work with. Getting started from maybe most obvious to least obvious. The first group that I really want to make sure that you're engaging with if you're a diversity, equity, and inclusion professional within your organization is the employee resource groups. Again, most obvious to least obvious. We're starting with the most obvious. A lot of people recognize that diversity, equity, and inclusion professionals are inherently connected to the employee resource groups within an organization. We've spoken about in videos past the fact that employee resource groups can be really great tools in building an inclusive culture. These people who come together to create these groups really can build an inclusive space by creating events, activities, initiatives, and by supporting recruitment and other things across the organization, like marketing and all of that. There's so much that these groups do. And diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders and professionals within an organization should be engaging closely with their employee resource groups and meeting with them regularly. And that's actually something I should point out. Ideally, we're meeting with all of these stakeholders on a regular basis. Perhaps it's monthly, perhaps it's every other month, perhaps it's quarterly. But if you are a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader, hopefully you have these 5 different stakeholders on your calendar on a regular basis. So you're checking in and making sure that you're aligned and leveraging these groups to support your overarching diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. Let's move on to number 2. The next stakeholder that you should really be thinking about is your recruitment team. Now, again, every organization is different. So maybe you call it the recruitment team. Maybe this is your talent acquisition team. Maybe your talent acquisition team is just 1 or 2 people. In either case, you should be working very closely with this group that brings in talent. And again, we're going most obvious to least obvious in terms of the stakeholders that we know diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders should be engaged with. And I say that because often when people talk to me about diversity, equity, and inclusion, one of the first things they think about is recruitment. So hopefully this is already on your radar as something, or as a group, a stakeholder group that you should definitely be engaged with. That's your recruitment team. Let's move on to the next group, or the next stakeholder, and that is your HR business partners. So you should absolutely be engaging with your human resources business partners. Now, again, different organizations call these folks different things, but essentially these are people who are engaging with different functions across your organization and ensuring that information is trickled down and across all of the different groups, making sure that everything related to human resources is supported. And these folks can sometimes know better than anyone else the different dynamics that are taking place within their functions. You'll want to make sure that you're engaging with your HR business partners regularly, especially if you have initiatives that touch particular functions, or especially if you know that there are some recruitment needs within certain functions that you're going to need to engage with and make sure that there's diversity top of mind. We also always want to be thinking about our HR business partners as we're conducting any sort of pushes across diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our HR business partners can help us get on people's calendars. They can help us engage in a town hall or something of the sort that's related to each of the different groups. So we'll want to make sure that we're keeping that in mind and that this group is one that we meet with regularly. Moving on to our fourth stakeholder, we're getting into the spaces that are maybe a little less obvious for folks. We want to be partnering with our learning and development team. Now, again, every organization is different. Some organizations have full teams dedicated to the learning and development. Other organizations just have one or two folks. In either case, you're going to want to make sure that you're engaging with your learning and development team to do several things. But training is often a key component or an important component of any DEI strategy. So you'll want to make sure that your diversity, equity, and inclusion training is incorporated into your learning and development overarching goals and plans. Now, that said, that's not the only reason why you should be engaging with your learning and development team. The learning and development team is often first to know when there are certain things that your different functions across your organization need in terms of training and development. Sometimes there are places within the realm of leadership coaching and management where inclusion should be infused, where equity should be infused. And so being really aligned with your learning and development team can really help you support your leaders and your organization in their learning goals overall. You might also want to consider looking at all of the different offerings that your learning and development team provides and making sure that it is aligned with the inclusion practices that you know can go a long way to creating a more inclusive workplace. So again, those are the four. We've gone through four so far. And then the fifth group that sometimes is off people's radar is your organization's legal team. Now, you might be wondering, why should I be engaging with the legal team? For some of you, it's very clear why you should be engaging with the legal team. But what I found in coaching and supporting different diversity, equity, and inclusion teams, it's that the legal team is not always one of the stakeholders that they're engaged with. And that's important for us to think about because, in fact, there are many instances where the legal team plays a role in helping us understand what the organization is comfortable with doing, especially as it relates to demographic data. So when we think about leveraging demographic data to make decisions, we'll want to make sure that we're fully aligned with what our legal team needs and desires as far as any sort of risks that it feels it might be taking on when we're doing that kind of analysis. We also want to make sure that we're engaging with the legal team if we're ever doing any reporting, especially if we're reporting publicly as we are looking at any sorts of differences in demographic data across different levels of the organization. So again, your legal team should be one of the 5 stakeholders you absolutely engage with. All right. Well, hey, we're done with the 5, the list of 5 stakeholders that we all know we should be engaged with. I'm just going to go back to this first page here just to remind us that these are just 5 of the many stakeholders diversity, equity, and inclusion leaders need to be looking into. Now, when you are a diversity, equity, and inclusion leader or professional, we have to think of our roles as very much all about building stakeholder relationships across our organization, because that allows us to build that buy-in that we all need in order to really make progress. So these are just 5 of the many stakeholders I hope you're taking the time to dig into as you're putting your calendar together for the rest of the year. Okay, we just went through the 5 stakeholders that you need to be working with, and this was your weekly wisdom. I have 1 more minute left to remind you that we are here to support you with whatever diversity, equity, and inclusion needs you may have. So if you do have any diversity, equity, and inclusion needs, you can always come to us at cnetwork.com/consultation. You can speak with myself or one of my other team members and get a sense of how we might be able to work together on any of the diversity, equity, and inclusion needs you have. As a boutique diversity, equity, and inclusion firm, we've seen it all. Should I say that? We've seen a lot at this point. So make sure you're either following up with us via consultation or looking into our social media accounts. You can see them all listed here. And with that, that was this week's Weekly Wisdom. It was great to see you all, and we'll talk soon.